They say he's cold, distant, hard to love, but they never ask what it costs to be warm in a world that punishes honesty. He wasn't born guarded, he became it. After every truth that made someone flinch, after every moment of openness that met silence. People didn't embrace his mind, they studied it, judged it, then turned away when it burned too bright. So he stopped offering it, not out of malice, but out of mercy. He filtered himself into softer sentences, smaller emotions, bite-sized thoughts, not to connect, but to survive. Because intelligence doesn't make you superior, it makes you exhausting to people who only want mirrors, not depth. You think he's antisocial? No. He's just done performing for people who clap for compliance and ghost clarity. Most don't want truth, they want comfort. So he stopped handing out explanations like apologies, stopped shrinking himself into something more chewable. They called it cold, but it wasn't. It was clear, and in a shallow world, clarity feels like cruelty. So he vanished, not because he hated them, but because he refused to keep bleeding for those who only knew how to collect the stains. He doesn't fix what's meant to misunderstand him. He doesn't chase echo chambers. He walks away, quietly, completely, not in bitterness, but in defense of his own mind, because when you finally see how truth is punished, solitude stops feeling lonely. It starts feeling holy. They don't leave, they vanish, slowly, quietly, not out of anger, but because visibility costs too much. It costs clarity, peace, the right to be whole. Society never asks men to be understood, it asks them to be useful, smile, perform, provide, but never unravel, especially the intelligent ones, because the more he sees, the less he can pretend. And that's what makes him dangerous, not his rage, but his refusal to wear the mask. Clarity doesn't soothe people, it reveals them. It strips illusion, and in a world built on performance, the man who sees too clearly becomes a liability. He stops softening, stops smiling through the lie, stops pretending shallow is enough. And so he disappears, not as punishment, as protection. You won't see tears, just distance, a quiet exit from every room that demanded he shrink to stay. Because truth in the wrong crowd sounds like hostility, feels like betrayal. They won't call it honesty, they'll call it damage, and the cruelest part, he'll start to believe them. Intelligence becomes a sentence, not a gift. It means feeling insane in rooms everyone else calls sane. It means noticing the manipulation hidden in kindness, the desperation behind every laugh. It means watching yourself vanish just to be allowed in. And when he finally walks out, they won't notice, because he was never truly seen. That's the grief. Not being left, but being invisible while present. And here's what Nietzsche warned without mercy. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. That's not poetry, that's prophecy. Because once you see through everything, you don't just lose others, you lose the illusion that you were ever held. They say he's too picky, too intense, too complicated, but what they really mean is, he saw something I wasn't ready to confront. That's the first lie, whispered not to protect the truth, but to protect their reflection. Because if they admitted it, if they said, he didn't choose me because I wasn't deep enough, it would break them. So they flip it. They call him distant, unavailable, cold, but he's not unavailable, he's untrusting. There's a difference. He wasn't born guarded, he became that way. In rooms where his depth was mistaken for damage. In moments where honesty was met with unease. You've heard it. You overthink too much. Translation? Stop noticing what I'm trying to hide. They call it overthinking, but it's precision. They call it arrogance, but it's the refusal to shrink. They call it mood swings, but it's emotional discernment. The truth is, people don't fear intelligence, they fear exposure, because the one who sees through the mask is the one they can't control. And when he speaks, it's not the volume that disturbs them, it's the vision. He hears what isn't said, notices what others edit, That's why he's labeled too much, not because he is, but because they are too little. And in a world terrified of being seen clearly, the one who sees will always be punished first. So he pulls back. Not out of arrogance, but exhaustion. Because shallow acceptance feels more suffocating than sacred solitude. And here's the ache no one admits. It's not rejection that breaks you, it's the slow death of hiding your mind just to be allowed in. That's when he stops trying to be palatable. He starts choosing peace over permission. You ever sit at a dinner table full of people who claim to love you and still feel completely alone? You smile, you nod, you pass the salt, but inside you're disappearing. Not because you're weak, but because there's no room at that table for the unedited you. Every word feels like mimicry, every laugh a costume. You try to speak, really speak, and the whole room freezes. So you don't. You become agreeable, predictable, digestible, until one day you forget the sound of your own voice. And they call it connection. But that's not connection. That's camouflage. And intelligent men see it too clearly to survive in it. They feel the weight of pretending before anyone else notices there's even a mask. That's the curse. When your perception sharpens, your tolerance rots. So you vanish. Quietly. You ghost the group chats, decline the calls, say, "I'm just tired." But what you mean is, "I'm tired of leaving myself outside the door just to feel included." You think he's difficult. But the truth is, he's precise. You think he's guarded. No, he's just tired of handing out pieces of his soul to people who only come to warm their hands, then walk away. You think he's disconnected, but he's simply unwilling to lie just to connect. That's the secret no one wants to say out loud. Today, connection isn't built on truth. It's built on compliance. Shrink a little, smile more, filter your honesty. That's the tax for being tolerated. And he won't pay it anymore, not because he doesn't crave closeness, but because he's learned the hidden price: self-erasure. He'd rather sit alone, buried beneath the full gravity of his thoughts, than dilute them for a seat at a table built on pretending. He's not afraid of love. He's afraid of the betrayal that comes after, the betrayal that asks him to become smaller just to make others feel bigger. So when he finally sets a boundary, when he says, "This is who I am," the world pulls back, not because he's wrong, but because he's no longer moldable. They call him cold, dramatic, too much. But what they really mean is, you stopped being controllable. Because clarity threatens illusion. And in a world high on small talk, deep presence is rebellion. That's why he walks. Not because he hates people, but because he refuses to betray himself just to sit beside them. Read that again. Not because he hates people, but because he refuses to betray himself just to sit beside them. That's the real loneliness, not being alone, but being surrounded and still starving. So he stops performing. He lets the silence stretch. He lets the distance breathe. Not to punish, but to protect. Because the cruelest discovery is this: most relationships don't ask you to be yourself. They ask you to go blind. And the moment you realize love requires amnesia, you stop begging to be seen. You choose vision, even if it empties the room. Nietzsche didn't call solitude a problem, he called it a test. A brutal, silent test, not of intellect, but of identity. Can you still recognize yourself when there's no applause? When your words echo back, unheard? Most can't. That's why they chase noise, applause, likes, reposts, not for joy but for proof. Proof that they still matter, but they still exist. But the intelligent man, he doesn't scroll, he sits. In silence, in stillness, in rooms that feel like tombs. Not because he prefers it, but because he knows something most never will. Truth doesn't scream, it whispers. And you can't hear it when the crowd is clapping. He who cannot endure solitude cannot be free. That wasn't inspiration, that was a warning. Because freedom isn't soft, it's disorienting. It's the ability to think without permission, to feel without approval, to walk away without leaving a note. And that terrifies people. That's why the intelligent man stays alone, not to escape connection, but to escape distortion. Because the moment you need to be liked, you start editing your soul. The moment you crave to be understood, you start rehearsing your honesty. And Nietzsche knew, the higher the man climbs, the thinner the air gets. Less voices, less mirrors, less rewards, more weight, more silence, more seeing. Because clarity doesn't make life easier, it makes it unbearable. You see everything, you feel everything, and there's no one left to carry it with you. So the real question isn't, why are intelligent men alone? The real question is, how many can survive being awake in a world that punishes awareness? This isn't solitude. This is exile by perception. And most don't make it. Not because they're weak, but because truth is a burden that kindness cannot carry. He knows too much to pretend, but he still aches to be seen. That's the war. His mind says, stay alone, stay intact. His heart whispers, just once, let someone in. And so he does, softly, slowly. He lowers the volume of his thoughts, shrinks the sharp edges, translates himself into something lighter, easier, and for a moment, they love it. The mystery, the brilliance, the calm, but not the ache, not the raw, not the silence behind the eyes. They love the echo, not the source. They want the light, but not the fire. So when he shows them the full picture, the grief, the questions, the scars still bleeding, they blink, they freeze, they step back, and he folds. Not like paper, like steel under pressure, silent, controlled, devastating. A quiet calculation he's made too many times. Do I stay honest or stay accepted? Eventually, he chooses silence again. Not because he's cold, but because silence costs less than rejection, because vulnerability is currency, and he's tired of paying to be misunderstood. You think he's distant? No, he's drained, not from solitude, but from the emotional gymnastics of being palatable, from breaking himself into bite-sized pieces, from translating his soul into a dialect that doesn't scare people. So he stops. He disappears in plain sight, not to punish, to preserve. Because every time he's been seen, he's been measured, and every time he's been measured, he's been told to shrink. And one day, he stops asking, how small must I become to be loved? Instead, he chooses to stay whole, even if that means staying alone. Here's the truth no one dares to say. Society doesn't fear the broken. It tolerates them, labels them, pities them, because the broken still follow scripts, still seek approval, still play the game. What it truly fears is the untouchable. The man who doesn't need applause, doesn't beg to be seen, doesn't perform pain for permission. Intelligent men don't terrify because they're unpredictable. They terrify because they're free from shame, free from roles, free from needing to be digestible. And in a world built on compliance, that kind of clarity is a threat. So what does society do? It doesn't kill the free man. It diagnoses him. You're too intense, too distant, too complicated. No, he's just done auditioning for belonging. He's unavailable not to love, but to distortion. Because once a man realizes that shrinking is more dangerous than solitude, he walks, not to rebel, but to remain whole. And the room doesn't chase him, it waits. Waits for loneliness to crush him, for silence to soften him, for time to break his will and bend him back into something small. But some men don't bend. They vanish without apology, rebuild without explanation. They don't return. They don't explain. They don't seek permission to be whole again. And what they build, you won't recognize it because it wasn't designed for applause. It was built for survival. You think your isolation is just bad timing, just bad luck, just a string of wrong people. But what if it's none of that? What if it's the design? Society doesn't say, be small out loud. That would be too easy to reject. It whispers it through rewards, through applause for obedience, through silent punishments for truth. It flatters the agreeable, promotes the harmless, celebrates the men who make themselves soft enough to swallow. From the moment a boy learns to speak, he's told, smile more, think less. Be nice, not honest. Be charming, not challenging. And every system, home, school, work, whispers the same seduction. If you behave, you'll be loved. But intelligent men break the spell. They ask one question: why? And that question doesn't just disrupt, it threatens. Because when you stop entertaining the crowd, the claps go quiet. Not because you failed, but because you stopped playing, and that scares them. Clarity is contagious. One man who stops pretending makes it harder for others to keep lying. So what does the system do? It doesn't argue. It corrects, not with truth, but with isolation. They pathologize your awareness, label your solitude as sickness, your discernment as damage. But it's not personal, it's structural, a machine protecting its illusion. Because if too many men stop performing, the whole stage collapses. So instead of questioning their roles, they exile the man who sees the script, not because they hate him, but because he reminds them of everything they gave up just to be accepted. The most dangerous lie an intelligent man ever tells himself is this: maybe if I just try a little harder, they'll finally understand me. That's the trap. It never starts with their betrayal, it starts with his own. Not a loud, dramatic collapse, a quiet bending, a subtle dimming. He doesn't break, he adjusts. He trims his thoughts to fit their comfort, dilutes his clarity into something less threatening, turns his mind into sound bites, his soul into subtitles. All in the name of love, or so he tells himself. This is maturity, he says. This is compromise. But deep down, he knows. It's surrender in a tailored suit. It's self-erasure in slow motion. It's 1,000 small deaths performed with a smile. He becomes easier to digest, easier to like, easier to ignore. Until he's nothing but echoes of what once had weight, and no one notices, because he made it seamless, polite, beautiful even. That's the cruelty. When you betray yourself well enough, people call it growth. But one day he looks in the mirror and sees someone agreeable, but numb, present, but fading. A man who became so lovable he forgot how to live with himself. That's not evolution, that's extinction with manners. One day he doesn't feel angry. He doesn't feel numb. He doesn't even feel sad. He feels something far more dangerous: clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't shout. It severs. It doesn't beg or explain. It ends. Quietly. Efficiently. He walks into the same rooms, but something's different now. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't shrink. He doesn't offer pieces of himself in exchange for proximity. He just sees too clearly. He sees that the love he fought for wasn't for him, it was for the mask he wore, for the silence that made others feel comfortable, for the depth that never demanded to be returned. They weren't drawn to his soul. They were drawn to the fact that he never asked them to face their own. That's not love. That's emotional extraction. So he stops trying, not out of bitterness, but because he's done mislabeling depletion as connection. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't announce his exit. He doesn't explain the weight he's been lifting in silence for years. He just leaves, with stillness sharp enough to echo. And the world will call it withdrawal. They'll say he vanished. But no, he arrived. For the first time. Fully. Intact. No longer performing. No longer translating his worth into smaller syllables just to be invited. Because once a man realizes he was never too much, just in places too small, he doesn't mourn the exit. He breathes. Awakening doesn't rescue you. It exiles you. You don't rise into light, you sink into silence. A silence so heavy, it makes applause feel like a distant hallucination. You thought leaving would feel righteous, like liberation, like breathing clean air after years of holding it in, but it doesn't. It feels like standing over the ashes of a bridge you burned with your own hands. A bridge that led to warmth, even if that warmth was a lie. The people who praised your mask will disappear the moment you remove it. That's the cost. Truth doesn't earn you a seat. It empties the room. You don't get validation for waking up. You get punished for refusing to keep sleeping. Suddenly, you're not misunderstood. You're unmarketable. Not because you changed, but because you stopped being convenient. And the worst part? You miss the lie. You miss the noise, the predictable chaos, the smile you hated wearing. You scroll through old texts like a ghost haunting your own timeline. You hover over send, hoping someone, anyone, might remember the version of you that used to play nice. And in that silence, doubt grows teeth. You start asking if you ever worth anything when stripped of your usefulness. And here's the secret no one tells you. Freedom doesn't feel like a mountaintop. It feels like a void. Most men don't return because they were wrong. They return because clarity is heavier than illusion. Because in a world that confuses comfort with connection, the truth teller is always the first to be buried in silence. Eventually something shifts. Quietly, not with fire, but with a boundary. You stop apologizing for your silence, because now you see, it wasn't a flaw, it was your shield. You stop chasing softness in people who only liked the parts of you they could carry without effort. You stop shrinking your soul into easier sentences for people who never planned to hear the full story. And slowly, you become someone you don't abandon anymore. Not perfect, just intact. You stop confusing attention with affection, noise with closeness. You walk into rooms without shrinking, you leave without guilt. You don't justify your no, you don't rehearse your softness, because you finally understand your depth is not a pitch, it's not meant to be sold. You grow steady, not because the pain stops, but because you stop bleeding for people who keep handing you knives. And that version of you, the one who still feels, but no longer fractures, the one who still hopes, but never begs, that man isn't distant. He's directional. He doesn't hate people. He just stopped burning for the ones who only came to watch the fire die. They didn't lose you. They lost access to the version of you that twisted, shrank, stayed silent, just to make them comfortable. And no, you were never too much. They were just too unready to stand beside someone who doesn't dilute himself to be digestible. You stopped performing pain for acceptance, stopped asking how small you had to become to be loved, and in doing so you became the kind of man they quote, but can't handle. The kind they admire, from a distance, because your presence doesn't flatter their illusions, it burns through them. You don't bring peace, you bring a mirror, and most people, they don't want to be seen, they want to be worshipped. So they flinch, they exit, they label, not because you failed them, but because you revealed them. And here's the part Nietzsche never sugarcoated. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But he who sees through everything ends up standing alone, not as punishment, as proof. Because once you truly see, you stop belonging to places that depend on blindness to function. You don't need more people, you need fewer masks. You don't need louder words, you need to stop whispering truth just to keep others from breaking. And if that line stung, good. It means something and you remembers who you were before you learned to disappear. Don't scroll past this. Sit with it. Because chances are you've already shrunk in rooms too small, smiled through silence too long, and renamed self-abandonment as maturity. But surviving isn't healing. And being understood is not the same as being seen. So don't share this for me. Share it for the version of you who almost made peace with erasure. For the man who folded his fire into ashes just to be easier to hold. And if no one ever told you this, walking alone isn't a flaw. It's a signal. A compass pointing home. You were never meant to follow. You were meant to disturb the sleepwalkers simply by staying awake.